Hello, Year 13. Right, I'm going to talk you through a few essay titles now. Last week we looked at a couple of essay titles in class, and I think it's just something you need to practice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the end of your PLC. Now, clearly, I'll remind you here that you need to have done all this stuff if you want to pass your A-levels. Okay, so make sure you're working through this all the time and keeping an eye on the bits of it that you haven't done or you're not confident with. Um, okay. And at the end, of course, you've got your sample essay questions. The formatting's a little bit funny because it's on Drive. So I've got to look at four. I don't know why this formatting's funny as well, but 1, 2, 3, 4 questions you've got there. What I suggest you maybe do is just pause for a moment and look at them. Maybe just make a few notes or have a think about what you would say about these questions. And then I'll show you some ideas about what I would say or some ways to plan it through. Because I think one of the things you have to learn to do is just quickly come up with an argument. It's about this assessment objective 3. So it's about identifying the keywords really, really quickly and then coming up with an argument. Now, of course, to do this well, it can't just be a very obvious argument. It needs to show a little bit of debate and a little bit of subtlety. Show that you know a lot about the text because you're able to come up with more subtle or more thoughtful points than just the obvious or the things that might immediately spring to mind. So I'm just going to try and model for you some of the sorts of things that you might write about in section B. There's no definite answers. They're just ideas of my initial thoughts about some of these essays. Right. So here we go. First one. To begin with, to what extent do you think Gothic literature is characterised by a fascination with death? Now, classic style of question. You've got the to what extent bit, and then at the end here we've got by a fascination with death. Now, it would be easy to say, oh yeah, they've all got loads of death in them. So I agree with that. But that wouldn't be subtle enough. You've got to be engaged with this idea about fascination. Now, what does that mean? That implies a real central interest, doesn't it? That the literature is centrally interested in the idea of death. And you've got to quickly come up with an argument for or against that. Now, basically, what I'm going to say, and I'll give you a bit more detail in a minute, but in my head, I would say is Macbeth characterised by a fascination with death? Is this the thing that stands out most about it? A bit, not really. Frankenstein, yeah, pretty much the same, a bit, but not really. And The Bloody Chamber, not really. Now, of course, if that was it as your plan, you're going to struggle a little bit for detail. But you might write that. You don't have to write a lot in a plan on the actual essay. But to give it a bit more detail, what I mean by that is Macbeth, I would say, there is partly a fascination with death. You could argue it. Your arguments for would be that death is prominent and recurs throughout. You've got Duncan, Banquo, Macbeth, Macbeth at the beginning in killing MacDonald, the death of the Thane of Cawdor. There is loads of death in it. I'd also maybe point out that structurally it begins and ends with death. So there is a lot of death in it, right? So I'd make that point. It could therefore be argued that the play is fascinated with death because it's a very blood-soaked play. However, I would then go on to try and add a bit of subtlety by saying I wouldn't say it's fascinated with death itself. It's not really about the fear of death. The real focus of the play isn't about what it's like to die or people dying. It's more about the things that happen when people are alive. In my mind, the consequences of treachery and of murder. It's a play about what happens when an individual takes a step too far and goes into a situation where they can't come back. I think about writing about Macbeth's soliloquies and the way they give us an insight into the mind of a fallen man, a man who was good and has become bad. I'd maybe link to the sort of James I context there. So do you see what I mean? I'm saying, well, yeah, okay, you could argue there's a fascination of death, basically because there's lots of death and murder in it. However, I don't think I think there's other things that the play is more fascinated by, that it's more characterised by, and those are the kind of psychological implications of treachery or murder or regicide or whatever you want to call it. Okay, Frankenstein, I'd say similarly, there's lots of death in it, but I wouldn't say it was fascinated by death. I'd say it was more interested in themes or ideas about hubris, about isolation and the treatment of individuals, the outsider, that sort of thing. And similarly with The Bloody Chamber, I'd say again, yes, it is prominent. there is lots of death in it, but really the stories have a stronger focus on things like latent sexuality in fairy tales. You see what I mean? So my conclusion to this essay would be, I wouldn't really agree that Gothic literature is characterised by a fascination with death. It's really a fascination on life and on the decisions that happens to people when they're alive, if you see what I mean. So that's one example of just how you try and get that sense of argument. It's these things here. Partly, yes, to some extent I'd agree, but also disagree, because similarly, yeah, you could argue that there's lots of death in it, but it's not really a fascination. Okay, so I'm saying similar points really for all three texts there. Let's look at another one. Gothic writing warns of the dangers of aspiring beyond our limitations. Gothic writing warns of the dangers of aspiring beyond our limitations. How far does your reading of Gothic writing support this view? So let's look at this question. We've got warning. Is Gothic writing a warning? And we've got the dangers of aspiring beyond our limitations, being ambitious to achieve things that are beyond our capabilities. Does our view of reading of Gothic writing support this view? Okay, so what could we say? Well, we could have a little introduction, just the idea, showing that we know that Gothic writing often is seen as a sort of cautionary tales, and often does carry warnings, going back to kind of early Gothic, Anne Radcliffe, that sort of thing. Okay, but let's get stuck into our argument. What would I say? Does this writing warn of the dangers of aspiring beyond our limitations? Now, for me, I'm immediately thinking Frankenstein, and I'm immediately thinking, yes, I absolutely agree that you could apply that idea to Frankenstein. It's an exploration of the romantic ideas of man's hubris, mankind and science getting over-ambitious and exploring things that it should leave alone because they are spiritual or religious or godly. So I think you could make a really strong case that yes, that does. And obviously you'd have to then exemplify it and talk about it and give examples of where it's happening in the text. But basically in my argument, I'd say yes. Macbeth, does it warn of the dangers of aspiring beyond our limitation? That's more interesting. So let's think more deeply. Yes, to some extent. You could argue that his decisions to kill the king is him going beyond his limitations. Now, you could see that from a religious point of view contextually, because the notion of the divine right of kings and the king being God's representative on earth, and then you could say Macbeth is, he's sort of aspiring beyond his limitations as a non godly figure by killing the divine. It's sacrilegious, so therefore he's going beyond what should be his limitations. However, you could then argue against that. He does achieve it. He does. It suggests it's not beyond his limitation, because he does achieve his goal of becoming king. So therefore, the text becomes closer to something like a warning against treachery, or a warning against disloyalty, or something like that, rather than going beyond our limitations, if you see what I mean. And now, what about the bloody chamber? Well, you could argue not really, and in fact, often she doesn't warn against aspiration beyond our current limitations. Carter seems to suggest that she examines those limitations, particularly from a sort of gender perspective. She maybe suggests that limitations can and should be challenged and should be overthrown. So it's not really a warning, it's more of a sort of urging you to do that, urging people to do that. So women in particular are limited, if we're talking about limitations, by society and by patriarchy and things like that, and it's good for them to overthrow these conditions. So it exposes going beyond limitations, but in a positive way, in a good way. I'd be thinking, for example, about the bloody chamber. The first thing that struck me was the idea of the necklace that she's wearing, kind of choking her, isn't it, and holding her in, and the necklace being a symbolic example. So in conclusion, what would you argue? You could say in some maybe more historical texts, like Frankenstein and Macbeth, you can see more of a sense of a warning against aspiring beyond what should be human limitations. More modern texts, what Carter seems to do is actually the opposite, is to say, no, these limitations are imposed, they're repressive, and they're wrong, and therefore it's not a warning, it's an urging or an encouragement to overcome them. Do you see what I mean? have a really good think about that. See, make sure you understand how you could construct an argument in this way. Well, I'm going to stop here for a moment and then make a part 2 where we'll look at the next two questions.